Well, hello, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of the Risk Matrix with myself, Dr. Logan Martin, and Mr. James Junkin. Hello, James.
Hello.
Here we go again. Let's talk about all things risk.
Well, it's good. We've had 2 weeks of guests back to back. Now it's just me and you, giving our views on occupational safety and health risk, bringing workers home safe from high hazard jobs. And guess what? I've got some rip from the headlines news. Things are getting better. BLS data's out for 2024, and it looks like 100,000 workers less were injured in 2024 than the previous year. So it went down from 2.6 million to 2.5 million.
Well,
But still,
that's
that's a
pretty
lot.
good. We like to see moving the needle, right? But you know where we need to move the needle? Fatalities.
That's a fact.
And when you ring me up and you tell me if the fatalities have gone down by an order of magnitude, I'm going to be so excited. I mean, I'm excited for that, but let's start working on things that really, serious injuries and fatalities.
I mean, I'm
That'd
glad
be
we've injured less, 100,000 less workers, but we still injured to an OSHA recordable
2.5 million.
standard 2.5 million people.
Yeah. Well, you wonder why we're using that injury tracking system, right? That gives us a good litmus of what's going on as long as people are diligent about entering their 300 logs in there. And speaking of which, hopefully everybody March 1st went in there and did their injury tracking logs if you're a high risk industry. And if you haven't, you probably should take a look at that and make sure that you're not either subject to it or subject to it and get those numbers in, because as James and I have mentioned on previous shows, people are getting fined and OSHA violations for not getting that injury and illness information up to the BLS.
It's
So
worth
if you want to learn more about that,
2,500 bucks to you. You better get it in. It's another
yeah,
one serious.
if you need more information about that, you can get a hold of James or I. Hit us up on LinkedIn, call us up. We can tell you where that is, or you can just search injury tracking application, OSHA, and it'll give you all the information about how to do that. So, James, I want to talk about something today. You know that we both put out a bunch of articles. Um, One of the ones that I found interesting recently that I did an article about was this fella. I think his name is Alex Honnold. He's a climber, right? Professional climber, as if right. He professionally climbs things and gets paid to do it, right? And recently, I watched a documentary on this guy, and he was the first to solo. I think it was Half Dome in Yosemite, and by that I mean he did it without ropes, without any aids,
Free
just
climb.
him. What?
He free climb, huh?
He free climbed, but no ropes, no fall protection, nothing. Right? Made it to the top. He's the only one to ever have done it. Very risky. And then uh, more recent than that, he was just climbing a tower of several hundred floors in Taipei. Free climbed it to the top with no ropes, etc. And what brought this to my mind, James, is they did a study on this individual, right? They looked at his brain waves, and what they found was um, he has no response. His brain does not respond to anything that would cause the rest of us fear. There's no brain activity when it comes to being afraid of heights or afraid of different things. And it occurs to me that this can be a very dangerous thing in the workplace, um, because employees, I'm going to make an extrapolation here. Employees probably have different responses to fearful situations or hazards, right? What might be fearful for you is not for me, and therefore our risk tolerance is different.
Well, I'll tell you, my immediate reaction to that is you'll definitely show up in what people consider to be hazards. If I don't fear it, then I don't respect it, then it doesn't end up on my JHA, JSA, or in my, you know, pre-task plan. whatever risk management tools you're using to identify hazards and put controls in place. So now we're not only endangering ourselves, we may be endangering other people
right.
with this no fear factor. But
And similarly, if you're doing a task and things change, right? Because I know we've talked about this before on the show that you're doing a task, and one of the key things that's inherent in most individuals is that you get that inkling that something's not right, and you know to stop, or you know to back off, or you know to end the task, or you know to do some sort of check, right? And if you don't have that fear or that risk a aversion of risk, you might keep going, right? So, what I kind of wanted to focus on were some ideas, and hopefully you have some ideas for me on how a company can put in place what their risk tolerance is. How do they make up that risk tolerance, and how do they communicate it to their staff, and then communicate that this is what our collective risk tolerance is, that we're not going by what an individual might find risky.
so this is sort of a concept that's been around for a little bit. When we're talking about blue line safety, nothing ever work does not go in a linear fashion. Work is imagined versus actually how work is performed. Um, and I think everybody can agree with that. Even that I'm a process guy, and we need to follow the process, but some of the process needs flexibility, right? We need to be able to expand for contingencies. We need to be able to count for human error and mistakes and have some resiliency within the management system. But I like the idea of defining how much risk that we're willing to take and doing that in a matter that we know what our risk tolerance levels are outside of what's prescribed by regulation. I mean, you could have a company that says, "I don't care. They can go into confined spaces without doing air monitoring." I mean, they got a nose, right? We got a lot of high level talk. Well, we got an OSHA regulation for that, bro, right? But where the regulations give us the ability to select different hierarchies of control to address feasibility. When a prescribed OSHA rule, we can't comply with it for whatever reason. We need to define what those acceptable risk levels are. We need to be able to define with workers at the point of operation when they can make modifications to prescribed safety rules. Like,
Yeah.
if this is not going to work, then you can do this. But
But you
if
can't do
you're going to
that.
go over this, you're going to do a management of change. We're calling timeout. And we're going to get the team together and reevaluate.
Right. So I'm gonna give you an analogy, right? You and Ray, your grandson, how old is he now? 6?
7.
7, okay? You and Ray go to Disney World and you get on those cars, the cars
Yeah,
that he can drive,
yeah.
right? And you can drive it, he can drive it, your wife can drive it, anybody can drive it, right? But but there are rails to make sure that these cars don't go off. They either have bumpers to the sides, or they have a rail that they can't go without, and they have a limit, right, on how fast they can go. So even if Ray or James puts that pedal to the metal and veers all the way left, there's only going to be one, you know, there's going to be a stop for both of you, and it's going to be the same. So how do we do that, right? In my thoughts, I think how do we do that? First of all, we do hazard identification as a company, right? We make sure that we've identified the risks as a company, but then our policies, our procedures, our our rules, right? The regulations, they all come into play to form those bumpers and the speed limit for which we go, right? Can you think of anything else that we would throw in there, that would form the railings, so to speak, on the roadway?
Well, I think the tool you use is very important. It's too late when we get to the job site to start figuring this out. This should be part of the management decision. Uh, in really part of your holistic approach to risk management. So if you've got a risk register, you know what the hazards are, et cetera. And then when you get down to the task and you're doing your pre-task planning, that's a good place to identify what our escalation ladder is. To me, that's what we're talking about, right? So we've got prescribed controls that are in place, but we may need to deviate from that for whatever reason to accomplish the tasks that need to be accomplished. You need to define that because here's what's happening. It's getting defined. It's just not getting defined by management. It's getting defined by the workers in the field. That's why people crawl out of aerial man lifts and unhook because we didn't identify that and it's only going to take a second. That's why people don't tie off. That's why folks go into confined spaces without proper air monitoring. That's why all these things happen, okay? Because the worker's risk tolerance is greater than the risk tolerance of the company or the OSHA's risk tolerance, right? So the only time we're operating in the gray, in my opinion, is when we can't use the highest prescribed control, right? And this is coming from a legal basis. We ha- we can't lock it out. Why? It's not feasible for us to lock it out. We have to do something. We still have to protect the worker, right? All the way down through the feasibility chain. If you don't want the worker to define it, you better define it as an organization before they get out there. They're going to define it for you. The work will get done. I've been working with a client, which it's funny you brought this up. This was a whole project for a special client in defining escalation ladders in which we're going to let the workers make some decisions because we've already put some guardrails in place for them. For example, what happens if we need to take our safety glasses off for some reason? We still got to protect them, right? But why are we wearing our safety glasses to begin with? We need to figure out what the hazard we're protecting from in this particular instance. Maybe there is no hazard. If the hazard was rotating machinery and we need to take it off because we need to be able to see or whatever reason to make some adjustment and it's in the way or whatever the justification is, right? Well, why do we have them on? Because we've got fine machinery that's rotating. Well, what can we do here? If we got it in our plan and we isolate the energy and it's not rotating, maybe we don't need our safety glasses in this particular instance. Now, that may be totally off on that scenario. I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here on that. But
Yeah. So let's talk about something you and I see almost every single day in our professional practice, right? Something happens. We get
okay,
called in. We find out that companies have some things or nothing, right? And they say, "Hey, man, why do we need this whole safety management system? Why do we need all of this? Why do we need policies, procedures, JHAs, orientation, training, right? All of those things work together to set the risk tolerance for the company, right? Um, one size does not fit all, but when you
it's
do
not.
put that safety management system in place, it should fit the company and the risk profile."
Well, I'll give you one for James. OSHA says you can be within 10 feet of an energized power line that's 50 kV, right? James Junkin not going to be within 10 feet of an energized power line that's 50,000 volts. Have you lost your mind? So my risk tolerance for energy of that is like, I'm not going to get anywhere near it. I'm going to be at least 20 feet away, maybe further than that. You see people doing these things and being more conservative. For example, soil piles 2 feet from the edge of the excavation. But a lot of times clients are saying make it 4 feet. Why? Because their risk tolerance for them is a little greater. You'll see it also in practical application when it comes to chemical exposure. I've seen people say, look, the recommended exposure limit for H2S is 10 parts per million according to NIOSH. Well, we want 5 parts per million.
Right.
So you see people going that way and being a little bit more conservative. But if you're going to loosen controls and you're going to accept a little bit more risk, you need to do that in the planning stage of the work and make sure you've got guardrails and make sure you're checking all those boxes of why you're not using and documenting why not you're not using the highest level of control.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of defenses uh, to why you're not doing that when it comes to OSHA and enforcement activities. But really, I think those cases are rare. I think in most cases we can employ some type of hierarchy of control that protects the worker, right? But the preferred method, the legal method, is always the highest one that's feasible for you to use. Cost is a factor of feasibility. You know, safety people drive me insane sometimes, insane when it comes to controls. Like they live in a different world when it comes to resources. And I do this with my students. You know, you could eliminate the hazard for $200 million, but for 10 million, we can cut the exposure in half, and we're well below OSHA's PEL. You know, they want to go out and spend $200 million, like we just got $200 million sitting over here waiting around. You know, hey, let's do it. So elimination is not always feasible. It's not
Right.
always feasible. That's where the other controls come into place.
Right. So I mean, I guess what really kind of made me think when I started looking at these the climber and the way that he thinks versus the way you and I think. You and I aren't going to climb the Taipei Tower, and we're not going to climb without ropes on Half Dome. In fact, I might not even climb on Half Dome at all, but I'm certainly not going to do it without any ropes. Um, the company, I guess, my pitch here is the company needs to put in place everything that they need so that the worker clearly knows what's acceptable and not acceptable and what the limits are, right? And as you mentioned earlier, they also need to know where there's some flexibility for them to make a decision and where there isn't. So again, how do we do that? Policies, procedures, training, onboarding, coaching, right? Coaching at the task level. I mean, if you have a new worker and they don't know the risks and the hazards associated with what they're doing, um, they can either guess, right? Or you can supply them with a worker that knows those hazards or is well versed in what can happen if X, Y, and Z is done. So,
So,
there are a lot of ways to mitigate the risk. But you really kind of need to make sure that you've identified all those risks and put some type of uh, method in place of quantifying what the company will accept and what the company will not.
well, I've got a new client, and we're talking to them about their mission statement for the company because it's sending the wrong message. You know, we're going to accomplish the job no matter what, any way possible. You know, I don't want to use their slogan because I don't want to identify the client, right? Because they're making some changes. But the message that it sent to the rank and file was, we got these rules for safety unless they get in the way of us accomplish the mission. And if they get in the way of us accomplish the mission, I don't care if you're on a forklift, standing on a pallet 30 feet up in the air to retrieve a part. That's what we had to do to get the mission done, right? And that's all great. And everybody pats everybody on the back because we got the mission done till that worker falls off that pallet 30 feet and hits the deck and gets killed. Then we're all like, well, why was he violating our policy? Well, because
Not,
you sent the wrong message to begin with as to what our risk tolerance was. We don't want that. We don't want you to do that. If we're in that big a rush, we got something organizationally wrong with our process and operations to begin with. We shouldn't be in that kind of a rush, right?
yep,
So it's sort of a holistic approach, and I want to take this and kind of switch this to a little bit for a second. I've seen companies that have good policies that define risk based on what OSHA's regulations are or greater. But all of us have run across that cowboy, that hot dog, that person that's going to have no fear and do it their way, and they enjoy taking the risk. They want to be celebrated for taking the risk. And sometimes they're your best worker when it comes to production. You got to get those people out of your safety management system. They have to go because even if they don't get hurt, what are they doing? They're influencing the rest of the
Yeah.
team to take unnecessary risks that are beyond our risk tolerance levels. And sooner or later, one day, God will be watching.
And he won't be pleased.
And it's usually not the cowboy that gets hurt, it's usually somebody else. And it's usually pretty bad, something a band aid can't fix.
Cautionary tale for people, right? You have to be cognizant of your message always, right? You can't put one thing in writing and then say one thing, another thing, uh, while you're on a site, right? Or as a management professional about the mission, right? The mission has always got to be consistent. And if the mission is consistent and your rules are consistent and your discipline is consistent, you should have a shot at narrowing that band of workers taking unnecessary risks.
I mean, we can't be on time every time because that's not reality. But that tells people in transportation what? If we're behind because of traffic, because of weather, because we're late, because of we had a flat tire, we need to get there because we're on time every time. And now what we're doing, probably taking unreasonable risks, not only from a safety standpoint, but also a reputational standpoint. I mean, Facebook's full of these things. Whatever fail of the day, and it's always somebody's company logo, somebody's truck in the ditch, somebody flipped upside down, and not all of that's because of the messaging of the company. Some of it has to do with the behavior of the worker, the driver, the road conditions, all these other things. But I can't help but believe that that's not a contributing factor if the message from the top is on time every time.
That's right. That's right. So, I guess the takeaway today is risk tolerance, right? What is your risk tolerance as a company, not as an individual? You know, I hesitate to say, but well, I don't hesitate to say, I really think that you need to make sure that employees are clear that it's not how they perceive the risk, it's how the company perceives the risk. Now they should be involved obviously in some of these decisions because engaged workers, empowered workers, people that have a say or are asked for their knowledge in that process are more likely to buy into what the risk tolerance of the company is and why because they've been part of that decision making process. So I really encourage people who are looking at, you know, developing a risk tolerance for their company and making sure that everything is the same across their safety management system, that they include the workers, right? That they make sure that when the message is sent out, the buy-in is across the board.
You know, this is all I've always said this safety's pretty easy. It's just hazards and controls, hazards and controls. What controller we're going to use. Now, I'm going to take this a little bit further. I have a right, and people will say this, to put my life at risk. It's my life, it's my body. But here's the thing you're not just putting your life at risk, you're putting our company at risk. You're creating
And other
bad
people,
habits that put other people at risk. Okay. And I've seen people mimic other folks and they end up injured. I've grind for years without a face shield. And then somebody that's been there for 5 years grinds without a face shield, and then one day, guess what happens?
they lose an eye.
Lose an eye, nose, permanent scarring, so I'm big on the process. Figure out the process, define what risk, have a escalation ladder, if you will, on what you're allowing deviance from your controls. Put some guardrails in place. Have escalations but
Yep.
also safe to those, be reasonable too.
Yeah.
Be
Yeah.
reasonable too. If your answer is
And it's not.
always no, 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 and you're not willing to work with operations sometimes and figure out what acceptable risk is, you don't, you're really not being part of the team.
Yeah. And we know that we all don't think the same way, right? We all don't have the same politics. We all don't have the same idea of what happiness is and all this kind of stuff. It's same thing with risk, right? We all have a different litmus for what risk is and what we fear and what we don't fear. And so companies need to get on a page and stay on that page and have the workers help them define it so that it's the same across the board. That's the message today.
That's the message today. And if you
So
need to go beyond, that's what management of change is for.
exactly. We can cover management of change in another episode, but today's uh, message is just that. Make sure that you know what your risk tolerance is and that it's communicated across the board so that there's no guesswork involved in when to stop, how to stop, when to think, when you can make decisions and when you can't make decisions outside of that risk tolerance zone. So thanks again for listening. James, what can they do if they really like our show, which we
If
know they
you
do?
really like our show, like, subscribe. Hey, man, if you learned anything today, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you had fun today, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you think this message would be beneficial to some of your peers, hey,
Share it.
invite them, share with it. We're doing this for you. Big shout out to our partners over at Biofuels that continue to sponsor us in this. We're in season 3. You can find us anywhere you get your podcast, over on Spotify, over on Apple Podcast, Biofuels' YouTube channel, on LinkedIn, Substack. You could say, "Hey Alexa, play the Risk Matrix, baby," and we'll pop up. So there's an opportunity for you to connect with us on a lot of different communication streams. We appreciate you as followers. And thank you for what you do. Till next time, keep bringing those workers home safe from those hazardous jobs. Roll Tide, baby.
Roll
Peace
Tide.
out.